Night settled gently over the Mediterranean, but there was nothing peaceful about it. The sea lay still, dark as spilled ink, stretching endlessly around a jagged piece of land no bigger than a forgotten scar on the water. Malta, a sunburned, wind-carved island sitting directly in the path of history's greatest storm. In the fading light, its cliffs looked like broken teeth rising from the waves. Its villages, small clusters of stone homes with narrow alleys, clung to the land like survivors too tired to run. And at the center of it all, rising from the harbor like a wounded guardian, stood the ancient heart of the Knights Hospitaller. Forts with walls thick as mountains, towers that had seen centuries of battles, stones stained with the echoes of old wars. But nothing in Malta's long life compared to what was coming. The year was 1565, and far beyond the horizon, something massive was awakening. For now, though Malta slept, or tried to, a warm, heavy wind drifted across the island, rattling wooden shutters and carrying with it the faint smell of salt and dust. On the ramparts of Fort St. Angelo, a lone guard leaned against the cold stone and stared into the black water. He had been awake for hours, too anxious to blink, too afraid to close his eyes. Every whisper of wind sounded like oars dipping into the sea. Every shifting shadow looked like an Ottoman ship. Behind him, the fortress felt half alive. Torches flickered along the battlements. Armor clinked softly in the halls. Voices murmured in languages gathered from across Europe: French, Italian, Spanish, German. All belonging to men who knew they were standing on the edge of something far greater than themselves. For Malta was not just an island. It was the last wall between the Ottoman Empire and the heart of Christian Europe. And everyone knew it. Days earlier, rumors had blown in like storm clouds. Fishermen swore they had seen a horizon dark with sails. Traders arriving from Sicily whispered that the Sultan had sent his greatest warriors, Janissaries, Sipahis, the finest gunners in his empire. People said the fleet was so large it turned the sea into a black shadow. And yet, when night fell across Malta, the island felt disturbingly calm. In the Grand Master's chambers, Jean de Valette stood over a map lit by a single candle. His face, carved by age and battle, looked like stone in the golden light. At nearly 70 years old, he should have been resting. But rest was a luxury Malta no longer had. Valette traced a trembling finger along the coastline. Every cove, every cliff, every weak point. He whispered to himself, as if speaking to the island. Hold. Just long enough, hold. He knew the truth better than anyone. Malta was too small, too exposed, and too alone to survive a full Ottoman invasion. But retreat was not an option. Surrender was unthinkable. And the Knights, the last remnants of an order beaten and scattered by the Ottomans years before, had no home left but these cracked stones beneath their feet. Outside, the city of Birgu slept uneasily. Mothers rocked crying children. Merchants locked their doors. Priests whispered prayers in dark chapels. Even the stray dogs seemed restless, pacing the streets as if sensing the shift in the air. Because something was changing, something subtle but heavy. It felt like the island was holding its breath. By midnight, clouds rolled in, swallowing the moon and draping the island in darkness. The lone guard on the wall strained his eyes across the water. He felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He wasn't sure why. Nothing moved, nothing shifted. Yet something inside him felt wrong. He rubbed his eyes, looked again, and froze. Far on the horizon, a faint, flickering line of lights. Lanterns. Dozens of them. Hundreds. His breath caught. They were coming. He opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came at first, as if fear had stolen his voice. Then he gasped out a cry that echoed down the stone corridors. Within seconds, the fortress exploded into motion. Boots thundered across the ground. Bells rang from the tower. Torches lit like fireflies as the knights ran to the ramparts. Valette stepped outside just as the wind shifted, pushing the faint sound of drums across the waves. Low, steady, relentless, the first heartbeat of the siege. The Grand Master closed his eyes. He had heard that sound before, years ago on roads far from Malta, when he was a young knight fighting an empire that never seemed to stop growing. He whispered, almost to himself, "So, it begins." As the lanterns grew clearer, the scale of the invasion became horrifying. The sea looked alive, filled with galleys, transports, and warships stretching farther than any man could count. The Ottoman Empire had not come with a small force. They had brought an entire floating city of war. 40,000 soldiers were heading toward an island defended by barely 6,000 men. Many of them sick, old, or wounded from earlier battles. And yet no one fled. One young Maltese boy stood beside his father on a cliff near Sanglia. His small hand clutched the man's tunic as the boy whispered, "Will they destroy us?" The father didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, but the silence spoke louder than any words. Behind them, the church bells rang again. Slow, heavy tolls that rolled across the island like thunder. Every home heard it. Every heart felt it. The warning was no longer a rumor. It was reality, and the reality was terrifying. But something strange happened that night. Something the Ottomans could not see. As fear tightened its grip around Malta, another feeling rose alongside it. Resolve. Men who had never held a sword in their lives grabbed whatever they could. Axes, farm tools, hammers. Old men who could barely walk insisted on standing beside the knights. Women filled buckets, gathered stones, prepared to tend the wounded. Even children were seen carrying water to the ramparts. They weren't ready. They weren't trained. But they had something the Ottomans underestimated. They had nowhere else to go. Malta wasn't a stronghold of power. It wasn't a wealthy capital. It wasn't protected by mighty walls or endless soldiers. It was simply home. A home no one was willing to surrender. By the time the first Ottoman ships anchored just outside cannon range, dawn was already stretching across the sky, slow and golden, like the world refusing to rush into the violence ahead. The entire island watched from cliffs, rooftops, and towers. What they saw would stay burned in their memories forever. A sea filled edge to edge with ships, black banners flapping in the morning wind, rows of armored soldiers glimmering like metal waves, drums pounding like a giant's heartbeat. Malta, tiny, cracked, sun-scorched Malta, was staring into the eyes of the greatest empire on earth, a place that should have fallen, people who should have run, and yet they stood. In that first heavy moment, when dawn touched the sea and the first war cries echoed across the waves, no one knew how long Malta would last. Days? Weeks? Hours? What they did know was this: if Malta fell, the road into Europe would lie open. If the knights died here, their order would die with them. And if the island surrendered, the Ottomans would unleash a storm no one could stop. The world watched a lonely rock in the Mediterranean and waited for it to break. But as the sun rose and the first cannon crews rushed into position, something unspoken passed through the defenders. A single, fragile spark that refused to die. Hope. Thin, trembling, foolish hope. The kind of hope born only in places the world has already written off. The kind that makes the difference between a last stand and a legend. Dawn broke over Istanbul like a blade of gold cutting through smoke. The great city stirred awake, its domes and minarets glowing beneath the rising sun. But on this morning, the air felt heavier, charged with a strange electricity. Far across the Bosphorus, the docks were alive with the sounds of war, clashing metal, shouting officers, and the steady thud of marching boots. The Ottoman Empire was preparing to move, and every man who stood along that waterfront knew exactly where they were going. South, toward a small, defiant island called Malta. A lone janissary paced along the edge of the docks, watching carpenters hammer planks into place and sailors haul crates of gunpowder. His armor gleamed in the pale light, and his jaw tightened as he studied the massive fleet stretching down the coastline. Galleys with black sails drifted like shadows. Transports creaked beneath the weight of horses and cannons. Fire ships bobbed gently, waiting for their moment to die. This was not just an army gathering. It was an empire awakening. Behind him, the city roared with life. Merchants yelling, smoke rising from bakeries, children running barefoot along the streets. But here on the waterfront, a different rhythm controlled the world. The rhythm of war. The Janissary closed his eyes and breathed it in. The smell of tar, iron, and fear. He knew Malta was small. He knew it was isolated. And he knew the knights who held it were few in number. But the empire did not send this much force for an easy victory. Something about Malta angered them in a way no other place did. High above the city, within the Topkapi Palace, the Sultan's council gathered in a wide chamber draped with silk and shadow. Maps lay spread across a long table, weighted down by polished stones. Advisors whispered in low voices as the Grand Vizier traced a finger toward the center of the Mediterranean. "Here," he said softly, "the knights think their island protects them. They think we will forget them." The room fell silent. Everyone remembered why Malta mattered. The Knights Hospitaller had been a thorn in the empire's side for decades. From Rhodes to the coasts of Anatolia, they had raided Ottoman ships, kidnapped merchants, and disrupted the trade routes that fed cities across 3 continents. Even after being driven from Rhodes, they had continued their war, small, bitter, relentless. Malta became their nest, and the empire had grown tired of sparing it. Outside, the morning call to prayer rose above the palace walls, a long, beautiful echo rolling across the city. For a brief moment, the world felt still. But inside the chamber, decisions were being carved into the fate of nations. The fleet would sail, the knights would fall, and Malta, that stubborn rock on the water, would be wiped clean. On the docks, the air trembled as cannons were rolled into position. Some were so heavy it took 30 men to move them. Horses reared nervously as soldiers lashed crates of arrows to their saddles. Water barrels were stacked like towers. Everything that could be taken was taken. An older sailor paused beside a row of chained oarsmen. His hands shook as he counted the heads. "More than Rhodes," he muttered to himself. "Far more." For veterans who had survived the siege of Rhodes 40 years earlier, the memory of that battle still lived in their bones. They remembered the stubborn knights, the deadly tunnels, the bitter fighting that dragged on for months. But now, standing on the Istanbul docks, many wondered if Malta would be worse. Because this time, the Ottomans were not sending a message. They were sending destruction. Standing atop a raised platform, Admiral Piali Pasha surveyed his fleet. Even from a distance, his presence demanded respect. Calm eyes, a measured stance, the confidence of a man who had commanded victories across half the known world. But even he felt the weight of this campaign. Beside him, the legendary Dragut, the most feared corsair in the Mediterranean, stepped forward, his weathered face hardened by decades of sea battles. He looked toward the horizon as if studying the path to Malta itself. "It will be a long summer," Dragut said quietly. Piali nodded. "But a necessary one." Farther down the docks, soldiers knelt in prayer. Others sharpened blades or repaired armor. Young recruits stared at the sea, pretending they were not afraid. The smell of burning pitch mixed with the metallic scent of blood from slaughtered livestock prepared for the journey. It felt as if the entire empire was leaning forward, pushing its weight toward the southwest, toward a target that should have been insignificant, toward a fortress that should have shattered under the first blow, toward an island that had somehow become the center of a storm. As the sun rose higher, the drums began, slow at first, then louder, stronger, echoing through the stone streets. Every beat signaled another regiment arriving at the shore. Sipahi cavalry mounted horses decorated with embroidered cloth. Rows of archers marched with bows slung across their backs. Engineers carried crates of tools and fuse cords. And behind them all, like the backbone of the empire, marched the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite. Their steps were perfectly synchronized, their expressions unreadable. When they reached the ships, silence fell. A commander raised a banner, red cloth stamped with a golden crescent, and for a heartbeat, it fluttered in the wind like a warning. Then he lowered it, and the loading began. By noon, the sound of war drowned out the city. Orders shouted from ship to ship, chains pulled, tightening sails. Metal scraped against wood. Waves slammed against hulls heavy with soldiers. A young oarsman watched the sky as he waited for the command to board. He imagined Malta, a place he had only heard about in tavern stories and sailor songs. Some called it cursed. Others called it holy. But all agreed on one thing: it would not be easy. He looked down at his shaking hands and whispered a prayer under his breath. Far behind him, women stood at the edge of the docks, clutching shawls as they searched the sea of helmets for the faces of husbands and sons. No one knew how many would return, but every mother, every sister, every daughter knew what war with the knights meant. The island might have been small, but the knights were desperate, and desperate enemies fought the hardest. At last, when the wind settled and the final supply carts emptied, a horn blared across the water. The fleet stirred as if waking from sleep. Oars dipped into the waves. Sails snapped open. Admiral Piali stepped onto the deck of his flagship. The ocean stretched before him, glittering under the sun. He raised one hand. "Set course," he commanded. The order flowed from ship to ship until it reached the farthest edge of the fleet. Thousands of men leaned into their oars. Wood groaned. Water foamed. Then slowly, powerfully, the might of the Ottoman Empire began to move. People on shore watched in silence as the first ships slipped away from the harbor. Then the next, until the sea looked like an endless swarm of black wings spreading across the waves. This was more than an army. This was destiny in motion. And somewhere far to the south, on a lonely island preparing for death, the defenders would soon see these shadows across their own horizon. The empire was coming. And Malta, the island that should have fallen, was about to face a storm unlike anything the Mediterranean had ever seen. Night clung to Fort St. Angelo like a second skin. The old stones, rough and cracked by centuries of war, seemed to breathe in the darkness. Torches burned along the walls, their flames shaking in the wind, throwing long shadows across the courtyard. And in those shadows, the Knights of St. John prepared for what might be the last dawn of their lives. The sea below the fort whispered against the cliffs, but even its voice sounded tense, as if the island itself sensed the storm coming. Armor clattered softly in the gloom. Boots scraped against stone. Men moved slowly, quietly, like ghosts wandering through their own tomb. Inside a narrow hallway lit by dim lanterns, a young knight tightened the straps on his breastplate. His hands shook. He had come to Malta only 2 years earlier, believing he would serve a brotherhood of legends. Men who once patrolled the Mediterranean like kings, fighting pirates, protecting pilgrims, and defending the faith with an iron will. But now, as sweat rolled down his temples, he realized something bitter. This was not the order he had imagined. The Knights of St. John were no longer the powerful force they used to be. Their fleets were smaller, their allies fewer, their coffers nearly empty. And the men who stood here tonight were exhausted, scarred, haunted, yet every one of them had stayed. Malta was all they had left. In a chamber deep within the heart of the fort, Grand Master Jean de Valette stood over a table covered with maps. Candles flickered beside him, their light dancing across his weathered face. He was old, far older than a battlefield commander should be, but his posture was straight and his eyes were sharp. He traced a finger along the coastline, following the same route the Ottoman fleet would take once it appeared on the horizon. He knew they were coming. He knew they were coming in numbers no island this small should ever have to face. Behind him, 2 senior knights entered the room. Their armor was dented, their cloaks torn at the edges. These were men who had survived dozens of battles that left scars across their bodies and minds. But even they hesitated to speak. Valette didn't turn. "Reports." One knight cleared his throat. "The walls have been reinforced, but the men are tired. And," he paused, "some question whether we can truly hold." A heavy silence filled the room. Valette slowly lifted his eyes. "Let them question," he said. "Questioning is not fear. Fear comes when men stop preparing for death." Another knight stepped forward. "Grand Master, these men look to you for hope." Valette closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only he could hear. The breathing of the fort, the heartbeat of the island, the faint echo of an enemy still out at sea. "They must look for courage," he whispered. "Hope will not keep the walls standing." Outside in the courtyard, the young knight finally finished tying his armor. He lifted his helmet and hesitated, staring into its dark interior. The steel was cold, heavy. It smelled of sweat and rust. As he raised it to his head, an older knight approached. A man with a deep scar running from his cheek down to his collarbone. "You're trembling," the older man said softly. The young knight swallowed. "Only a little." The older knight nodded. "Good. It means you understand what's coming." He sat beside him on a stone bench. For a moment, the two simply listened to the wind scraping against the walls. "Do you know why we fight?" the older knight asked. "Because it is our duty," the young man replied. The older knight shook his head. "No. Duty is what keeps you standing in a line. Duty is what makes a man lift a sword. But duty is not enough to survive what is coming." He took a deep breath. "We fight because this island is our last chance to matter. The world does not fear us anymore. Kings no longer bow to us. Even the church barely remembers our victories." His voice cracked. "But here on this small, sunburned rock, we still stand together. And we cannot let this be the place where we vanish." The young knight lowered his head. He understood more than he wanted to. This was not just a battle. This was a funeral waiting to happen. A funeral for an entire order. Across the fort, monks carried crates of arrows and barrels of oil to storage rooms. Blacksmiths hammered out the final repairs on damaged helmets. Civilians, the ones who did not flee when the first rumor spread, gathered in quiet corners, praying or whispering to their children. The whole island felt like a held breath, like a candle about to be snuffed out. High on the battlements, 2 sentries stood watch. They stared into the black horizon, searching for any sign, the faintest form of a sail, the smallest flicker of torchlight. "Do you think we'll survive it?" one asked. The other shook his head slowly. "No." He pointed to the sea. "But if we fall, we'll fall where the world can see. And maybe that will matter." They both grew quiet. Back in the command chamber, Valette finally stepped away from the maps. He walked toward the window and looked out over Burgu. The narrow streets, the scattered houses, the torchlit walls where knights paced in silence. He had led armies before. He had fought pirates, defended cities, survived ambushes. But nothing in his life compared to what he felt now. Malta was his responsibility, his burden, his battlefield. He whispered to himself, "If the island falls, I fall with it." Behind him, another advisor entered. "Grand Master, the men ask for your word." Valette nodded. He stepped out into the courtyard, where dozens of knights had gathered around a fire, sharpening swords or fixing armor. When they saw him, they rose to their feet. Valette looked at them one by one. Some were old. Some were barely older than boys. All carried the weight of a dying order on their shoulders. "My brothers," Valette began, his voice echoing across the stone walls. "You know what stands beyond the horizon. You know the army that prepares to come for us. And you know how small we are compared to them." He paused. "But hear this, we do not fight for glory. We do not fight for revenge. We fight because this island is the last sacred thing we hold. And when the Empire strikes us, it will learn that even broken men can fight like giants." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. Valette raised his sword. "We may be few, but we stand on rock older than the world of kings. Let the Ottomans come. Let their cannons roar. Let their armies fill the sea. We will not bow. We will not flee. We will not surrender." The fire crackled behind him, the light painting his armor in gold and blood red. "This is our fortress," he said. "This is our final stand." The knights nodded, not with excitement, but with a grim, heavy acceptance. They knew what was coming, and yet they stayed, because whatever the Knights of St. John had lost, riches, fleets, power, fear, they still had one thing left, a reason to fight. Deep in the night, as the torches dimmed and the men tried to rest, The young knight climbed onto the walls and stared at the sea. It was black, silent, endless. Somewhere out there, the empire was moving toward them. He whispered a prayer. Not for victory, not for survival, but for courage. Because courage was all that was left. And by dawn, the Knights of St. John, cracked, bleeding, divided, would no longer be just a broken order. They would be the shield standing between a tiny island and the jaws of an empire. Dawn should have come softly to Malta. A pale gold creeping over stone walls, over the calm sea, over the tired faces of men who had barely slept. But on this morning, the sun rose into a sky already painted with smoke. The light that touched the island was not warm or gentle. It was red, violent, foreboding, unnatural. The defenders of Burgu and Sanglia would later swear that God himself had stained the heavens to warn them of what was coming. For days, scouts had whispered that the Ottoman fleet was massing beyond the horizon. Every night, torches flickered on distant decks like swarms of angry stars. Every night, the sea carried the low groan of drums, slow, steady, like a heartbeat of something approaching the island with monstrous patience. But dawn is honest, and this dawn revealed the truth that the night had kept veiled. They had come. The first line of ships was visible long before their hulls could be clearly seen. A dark smear across the water, a band of shadow stretching across the horizon. And then, as the sun climbed higher, the shadows sharpened into shapes, hundreds of them, galleys, galleons, transport, floating fortresses with rows of oars that sliced the sea like long knives. Never had Malta seen anything like it. Never had Europe. Inside Fort St. Angelo, men stood atop the battlements, staring in stunned silence. Even the oldest veterans who had fought in Rhodes, Tunis, and the long wars against the Barbary corsairs felt their throats dry. The scale of the approaching armada dwarfed imagination. It felt less like a fleet and more like an entire nation sailing upon the waves. A young Spanish arquebusier crossed himself 3 times, whispering rapidly as if the prayer could slow what approached. Beside him, a Maltese militiaman gripped the wooden railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They blacken the sea," he murmured, his voice trembling. "Madonna help us. They blacken the whole sea." But prayers could not hold back cannon fire. From the flagship at the center of the Ottoman line, a deep boom tore across the water. It rolled over the waves like thunder made of iron. The defenders flinched, their eyes snapping toward the source. A heartbeat later, a ball of fire arced high into the sky, rising, then descending toward the island like a comet dragged from the heavens. It struck the outer rocks near St. Elmo, exploding in a burst of flame and stone. The ground quaked under the soldiers' boots. Dust rained down the walls. Somewhere, a horse screamed, spooked into madness by the blast. It was the first Ottoman shot of the siege, the first of tens of thousands. Within minutes, the entire fleet erupted. From 100 decks, cannons thundered in a chaotic rhythm, overlapping, echoing, deafening. The sea shook with each blast. Smoke poured from the Ottoman ships in thick black columns, rising into the already tainted sky. The air tasted of sulfur, harsh, burning, metallic. The smell clung to skin, settled into hair, seeped into lungs. Even the wind seemed to carry fire. Inside the forts, the knights and Maltese scrambled into position. Orders were shouted, weapons loaded, stones hauled to the battlements. And yet many paused, even if only for a second, just to watch the display of destruction unfolding across the water. It was terrifying, yes, but also mesmerizing. Terrible beauty, a spectacle of war on a scale few had ever witnessed. Then the Ottoman cannons found their aim. The first direct hit landed on the walls of Fort St. Elmo. The stones shuddered, splintering under the impact. Dust billowed outward as chunks of the parapet crashed downward. The defenders recoiled, shielding their faces as debris rained around them. St. Elmo, Malta's smallest fort, had just become the first target of the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean. In Burgu, civilians huddled in alleys and cellars as the bombardment intensified. Mothers held children close, trying to mask their fear with soft voices. Old men leaned against walls, eyes closed, praying that the stone around them would hold. The entire city vibrated with each cannon strike. Roof tiles shivered. Windows rattled violently. Dogs barked until their voices broke. The sky darkened further as smoke spread, curling around rooftops, settling heavily between streets. Fire dust drifted down like black snow. And always, the thunder of cannon fire boomed through the air, relentless, merciless. Grand Master Jean de Valette stood atop St. Angelo, unmoving, as the storm began. At 70 years old, time had etched deep lines into his face, but none of them softened his expression now. He watched the Ottoman bombardment with an icy calm, his cloak snapping in the hot wind. A young knight approached him, breathless. "Grand Master, they've opened fire across the entire line." Valette did not turn. "Good," he said softly. "Let them roar. Stone can be rebuilt, but our resolve will not crack." Even so, every man who heard him felt a chill, for resolve alone would not be enough. The bombardment was only the beginning. By midday, the entire island was trembling. Cannonballs slammed into bastions, streets, and ramparts with brutal force. Some struck buildings head-on, sending wooden beams flying like broken limbs. Others buried themselves deep into the earth, spitting plumes of dirt skyward. The ground became a percussion instrument played by giants. On the Ottoman ships, crews worked feverishly. Powder, shot, fire, reload, fire again. Their commanders walked the decks shouting orders, driving the tempo faster and faster. Smoke swallowed them until only silhouettes remained, dark shapes moving through a drifting red fog. The defenders fired back with what cannons they had, but their guns were fewer, smaller, and mounted on older carriages. Their shots splashed against Ottoman hulls or vanished in the sea. Occasionally, one found a mark. A mast splintered, a deck erupted, but the damage was minor, swallowed by the sheer mass of the enemy's fleet. And still the cannons roared. By late afternoon, the sea itself seemed to have changed color. Where once it sparkled blue under sunlight, it now churned with soot and oil. Floating debris drifted across the waves. Shattered planks, broken oars, torched fragments of siege equipment. The water near St. Elmo steamed where fireballs had struck. A group of Maltese civilians climbed a rooftop in Birgu, hoping to catch a glimpse of the fleet. When they saw it, the endless rows of Ottoman ships, their sails taut, their oars slicing in perfect unison, they sank to their knees in disbelief. It was not just an army. It was a continent on water. Yet even as fear spread through the island, something else sparked in the hearts of the defenders. Anger. The bombardment was not merely an attack on stone. It was an assault on their homes, their families, their very existence. Every blast that tore into Malta only hardened their resolve. Every collapsing wall only stoked their fury. The Ottoman cannons demanded surrender, but the Maltese answered with hatred, defiance, and a grim promise. "We will not be moved." As sunset approached, the sky deepened into an even darker shade of red. The smoke glowed like burning velvet. The sea reflected the same hellish hue, creating the illusion that the entire world was aflame. The bombardment finally slowed. Not stopped. The Ottomans would never give Malta the mercy of silence, but slowed. The thunder softened to a steady, rhythmic pounding, like the distant beating of a war drum. The defenders used the brief lull to extinguish fires, rescue the injured, and drag rubble away from the gates. But the silence between cannon blasts was worse than the noise. Carried weight. A question. A threat. The siege had begun, and everyone, from the youngest squire to the oldest master, understood one truth as they stared at the burning sky. The storm that had arrived would not end until one side was ashes. Fort St. Elmo was never meant to be glorious. It was small, cramped, and awkwardly shaped. A stubborn triangle of stone perched on the tip of Mount Sybaris, like a lone tooth jutting into the sea. Yet in the summer of 1565, this modest outpost became the beating, bleeding heart of Malta's survival. Every man who entered its gates understood one truth. St. Elmo would not be saved. But through its destruction, the island might. The bombardment had barely stopped before the knights inside the fort began repairing the shattered parapets. Stones were lifted by bare hands. Beams were hammered into place with frantic urgency. Sweat mixed with dust until the men looked like ghosts coated in gray earth. Their fingers bled. Their eyes burned. Still, they worked without complaint. Above them, the banner of St. Elmo, a simple red field with a white cross, snapped violently in the wind. Torn at the edges, stained with soot, it had somehow survived the first day of cannon fire. The survivors took this as an omen, a sign that the small fort might last longer than anyone believed. But dawn brought no mercy. The Ottomans resumed their attack with renewed ferocity. Cannons mounted on sea platforms thundered from the left, while batteries on Mount Sybaris pummeled the fort from above. St. Elmo was caught between two jaws of fire. Stones shattered like pottery. Wooden beams cracked and caught flame. The air grew so thick with smoke that breathing felt like swallowing embers. Inside the courtyard, the knights and their Maltese allies crouched low as cannonballs smashed overhead. The ground trembled violently, sending dust cascading from every wall. A few of the younger soldiers flinched with each impact, but the veterans did not. They had long ago learned that fear is inevitable, surrender is not. At mid-morning, a horn sounded from the Ottoman lines. The bombardment ceased, and an eerie silence spread across the battlefield. The defenders exchanged tense glances. They knew what silence meant. Cannons softened walls, but infantry took them. From behind the smoke, rows of Ottoman soldiers emerged. Janissaries marched in tight formation, their white caps bright against the scorched earth. Behind them, Azaps and corsairs surged forward, shouting war cries that echoed across the water. Ladders were lifted, shields were locked, drums thundered to life. The defenders braced. At the seaward wall, arquebusiers took positions, their weapons trembling slightly in sweaty hands. Powder horns were opened. Match cords were lit. Every man waited for the exact moment the enemy came into range. Then the order came. A deafening volley exploded from the ramparts. Arcs of sparks burst from the muzzles as smoke billowed outward. Ottoman soldiers in the front ranks crumpled instantly, tumbling backward into the advancing mass. Screams pierced the air, but they were swallowed almost immediately by the roar of the charge. The ladders hit the walls with a sharp, splintering crash. Janissaries climbed with terrifying discipline, their movements fluid, rehearsed, relentless. The defenders thrust pikes downward, stabbing hands and faces. Boiling pitch poured over the edges, hissing as it splattered across helmets and armor. Stones were dropped from above, crushing skulls, breaking fingers, shattering shoulders. But more Ottomans climbed. Always more. On the right flank, a young knight named Francisco Balbi, the chronicler who would later document the siege, found himself surrounded by attackers who had managed to gain a foothold on the parapet. His blade flashed, cutting through smoke and flesh, but the enemy pressed in wave after wave. Dust stung his eyes. Blood soaked the stones beneath his boots. When his sword finally stuck in a shield and refused to budge, he switched to his dagger without hesitation. He survived only because a Maltese militia fighter leapt into the fray, swinging a hammer that cracked an attacker's skull like an egg. There was no time for gratitude. The next wave was already climbing. On the opposite wall, a Turkish commander shouted orders as his men surged forward. His voice rose above the chaos, confident, commanding, certain of victory. He believed St. Elmo would fall within hours. How could it not? The fort was small. Its walls were crumbling. Its defenders were vastly outnumbered. Yet what happened stunned even him. The defenders pushed the Ottomans back. Not permanently, not decisively, but long enough to force a retreat. Long enough to remind the invaders that Malta would not die quietly. By noon, the smoke was so thick that the sun became little more than an orange smear in the sky. Heat radiated off scorched stone. Powder burns marked the faces of every defender. The wounded groaned as they were dragged to the courtyard, where the fort's few surgeons worked with trembling hands and crude tools. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. Bandages were soaked through within minutes. Flies gathered in clouds. Yet no one abandoned their post. Not even when they learned the truth, St. Elmo was doomed. Messengers from Burgu arrived under a hail of Ottoman arrows, breathless and pale. They brought grim news. The Ottoman artillery on the Sybaris Peninsula had been reinforced. More cannons were being dragged into position. Fresh troops were arriving constantly. Reinforcements from other forts were impossible. St. Elmo would stand alone. And so the knights made their decision with stoic acceptance. They would fight until the last man. They would buy Malta time, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 miracle at a time. In the afternoon, a second assault began. This time, the Ottomans advanced with terrifying speed. Engineers pushed forward siege mantlets. Large wooden shields mounted on wheels. Behind them, sappers crawled toward the walls carrying long poles tipped with iron hooks. Their goal was simple: tear down the defenses. The defenders responded with sheer desperation. Barrels of stones were toppled from the battlements. Fire pots were hurled into enemy lines. Arquebusiers fired until their match cords burned down to their fingertips. Everywhere, men screamed, fought, and fell. On the rampart closest to the sea, an elderly knight named Brother Juan de la Pena stood firm despite a bleeding leg wound. When an Ottoman soldier gained the top of the ladder, Juan struck him with the blunt end of his spear. Another climbed up. Juan stabbed again. The third appeared. Juan did not retreat. He fought with the fury of a man who had already accepted his fate. When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, younger knights stepped forward to take his place. By sunset, St. Elmo was unrecognizable. Walls that had once been smooth and orderly were now jagged ruins. Craters pocked the courtyard. Fires burned in every corner, fed by broken beams and spilled powder. The smell of blood mixed with smoke until the air felt rotten. The Ottomans attacked again at dusk, determined to finish the fort before nightfall. But the defenders met them with a final burst of ferocity. They fought with empty lungs, trembling limbs, and raw voices that cracked from shouting. Every strike was fueled by the knowledge that their sacrifice was holding back an empire. When the Ottomans finally retreated, dragging their dead and wounded across the broken ground, the defenders collapsed where they stood. Some prayed, some sobbed. Others stared blankly at the darkening sky, unable to comprehend how they were still alive. Above them, the tattered flag of St. Elmo fluttered defiantly, illuminated by the glow of distant fires. The smallest fort on Malta had endured a storm meant to erase it in a single day. It had become a crucible of iron, smoke, and bone. A place where death walked openly and courage grew wild. But everyone inside knew the truth. Tomorrow the assault would begin again, and St. Elmo, though brave beyond measure, could not withstand eternity. Night crept over Malta like a slow-moving shadow, heavy and soundless. The guns fell silent. The screams faded. Only the crackle of burning timber and the soft moans of the wounded whispered across the ruined battlements of St. Elmo. For a moment, it seemed as if the island had paused, taking one shallow breath before the next storm. But peace in war is never real. As darkness settled, the Ottoman torches lit the ridge opposite the fort. Their flames flickered like a line of watchful eyes. The defenders, broken and exhausted, stared across the water with rising dread. They expected another assault, another wave of steel, another night spent fighting until their arms went numb. Instead, they witnessed something else, something far worse. On the Ottoman side, soldiers dragged bodies toward the shoreline, the bodies of the knights who had fallen earlier that day. They tossed them onto rafts like sacks of grain. Limbs dangled, armor clattered. Some faces were still frozen in the contorted shock of their final breath. The men of St. Elmo watched in confused silence. Then the torches lowered. A spark touched the rafts. Flames burst upward. Within seconds, the dead knights were engulfed in fire, dozens of them, burning together beneath the starless sky. The Ottomans pushed the flaming rafts into the water and sent them drifting toward St. Elmo like floating pyres. The defenders recoiled in horror. Some fell to their knees. Others covered their mouths as the wind carried the sharp smell of scorched flesh toward the fort. A few whispered prayers. Many could not speak at all. They had seen men die before, by sword, by cannon, by fire. But this was cruelty aimed at the living. The Ottomans were sending a message. Your dead will find no rest. Your fate will be worse. Brother Juan, still bandaged and pale from the day's fighting, stared at the burning bodies as they drifted closer. His voice trembled. They want to break us, he whispered. Break our hearts before they break our walls. But Jean de Valette, watching from the distant height of Fort St. Angelo, understood the deeper meaning. His jaw clenched, his eyes sharpened. If the Ottomans meant to wage psychological war, then Malta would answer with steel. Before dawn, he sent a signal across the harbor. A bright, urgent flare that streaked into the gray sky. The message was clear. St. Elmo must hold, and vengeance must be delivered. Even as the burning rafts bumped gently against the rocks of St. Elmo, the knights inside pushed past grief and disgust to prepare for the next assault. Their hearts were heavy, but their resolve hardened. If the Ottomans wanted hatred, they now had it. And hatred, they knew, could be a powerful shield. Morning arrived wrapped in a swirl of pale smoke. The fort smelled of ash, sweat, and dread. But the defenders stood ready, weapons in hand, their eyes cold. The mutilation of their brothers had done something the Ottomans did not expect. It stripped fear from the hearts of St. Elmo. Fear had been replaced by fury. The first cannon of the day roared from the Ottoman side, cracking the sky open like thunder. It struck the already crumbling wall, showering the defenders in dust and debris. Another shot followed, and another. Soon the bombardment became relentless, a rolling storm of iron and fire. But this time the defenders did not flinch. When the ladders rose again and the Janissaries surged forward, the knights met them with a merciless wrath. Their blades cut faster, their strikes hit harder. Every blow carried the weight of the burning bodies that had drifted toward their fort in the night. A young Maltese soldier named Pietro, barely old enough to shave, fought like a man possessed. With each swing of his sword, he whispered the names of the friends he had lost. His arms trembled from exhaustion, but he did not stop. By noon, Pietro's tunic was soaked with blood. Some of it his own, most of it not. On the northern wall, Francisco Balbi held his position as waves of attackers crashed against him. His armor was dented, his shoulder burned from a slash wound. But he fought with a freezing calm he had never felt before. They deny our dead peace, he muttered. Then let them earn their own. Still, no amount of fury could hide the truth. St. Elmo was dying. The walls cracked like brittle bone. Towers leaned at impossible angles. Fires burst from the ramparts faster than they could be extinguished. Powder was running low. Food was nearly gone. Some defenders had taken to drinking from puddles where rainwater mixed with ash. By late afternoon, the courtyard looked like a butcher's yard. Surgeons worked in a haze of blood and heat, their aprons stained deep red. Men screamed as limbs were cut away to stop infection. Others lay silent, staring blankly into the smoke-filled sky. One knight, delirious with pain, begged to be carried back to the wall so he could die facing the enemy. The fort was hell, and still they held. As the sun dipped low, painting the ruins gold and red, the Ottomans launched a final assault for the day. Their soldiers climbed aggressively, shouting victory chants. They believed the fort was seconds from collapsing. They believed its defenders were barely clinging to life. Both things were true, but they underestimated the human spirit. Jean de Valette, watching St. Elmo from across the harbor, ordered a surprise maneuver. He directed a small cannon from Fort St. Angelo to fire a special bombardment. Heated iron shot aimed at the Ottoman positions on the Sybaris Ridge. The glowing cannonballs arced through the air like falling stars. They struck the Ottoman trenches and set their wooden platforms ablaze. Ottoman soldiers scattered in panic as the fire spread. Cannons toppled. Powder stores erupted. Smoke billowed upward, dark and furious. On the walls of St. Elmo, the defenders cheered through cracked voices. It was a small victory, a momentary blessing, but in war, moments mattered. They clung to it like drowning men clinging to driftwood. When the final Ottoman soldier retreated into the smoke, night fell again. The fort was half destroyed, but still standing. The defenders were half dead, but still fighting. In the dark, as men tended to their wounds or whispered their final prayers, Balbi walked to the edge of the ruined parapet and looked across the water. He expected silence, but instead he saw torchlight. Rows of Ottoman soldiers moved through the night, carrying more bodies. More knights, more Maltese fighters, more men who had fought bravely and died painfully. The Ottomans piled the corpses at the water's edge. Then, with cruel ceremony, they beheaded the fallen and raised their severed heads on spears, turning them toward the living. For a long time, no defender spoke. Some shook, some wept, some simply stared. Finally, Balbi whispered the truth that none wanted to admit. They want us to break inside. But something deeper stirred in the hearts of the defenders, something the Ottomans did not anticipate. The dead would not rest, not in the ground, not in the sea, not in the minds of the living. Their memory became fire, their suffering became purpose, their desecration became a promise that St. Elmo would sell its life for a price the Ottomans would never forget. Tomorrow the attackers would return. Tomorrow the walls would crumble further. Tomorrow men would die again. But tonight, the defenders of St. Elmo made a silent vow. If the dead found no peace, neither would the empire that defiled them. Dawn crawled over Malta like a wounded animal, weak and gasping. The first light revealed the ruins of a world barely holding on. Toppled stone, shattered beams, and blood dried in the cracks of the earth. Fort St. Elmo had fallen days earlier, its defenders butchered and desecrated. Yet their sacrifice cast a long shadow across the island. It had bought time, but not enough. Now the weight of the siege shifted to Burgu and Sanglia, tiny peninsulas crowded with civilians, knights, and soldiers all clinging to the last strongholds. Fort St. Angelo and Fort St. Michael. These forts were stronger than St. Elmo, thicker, better armed, but they were not unbreakable. And the Ottomans were coming with a fury sharpened by loss and humiliation. As the sun reached the horizon, the first distant boom rolled across the Grand Harbor. The Ottomans were firing again. The walls of St. Michael shuddered under the blast. Dust rained from the stone ceiling of a chapel below, where villagers huddled together in the dim candlelight. Mothers clutched children. Old men prayed beneath their breath. The walls seemed to tremble with each strike, as if the earth itself feared what was coming. Above them, on the battlements, a knight named Guillaume de Montmorency wiped sweat and dust from his brow. His armor was scratched. His knees ached. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. He had lost more friends in the last month than he had in 10 years of war. But he stayed. Everyone who could fight stayed. Below, the sea glittered cold and silver, but the beauty of the morning felt like an insult. Across the water on the Siberia's ridge, the Ottoman camps stretched like a dark stain on the land. Thousands of soldiers moved in long lines. Cannons glowed red-hot from use. Drums beat with a slow, chilling rhythm, the heartbeat of an empire ready to crush what remained of Malta. And then the bombardment began in full. The ground shook. Walls cracked. A tower groaned as if alive. St. Michael endured the heaviest blows, taking the punishment meant to split the defenders in half. Huge stones splintered. Wooden beams snapped like bones. But the people did not run. They rushed with buckets of sand and water to smother fires. They dragged the wounded to shelters. They prayed. They picked up fallen weapons and threw stones from the gaps opening in their walls. This was not a trained army. This was a community refusing to die. Jean de Valette, high atop Fort St. Angelo, watched the devastation with tight, burning eyes. He had been a soldier his entire life, fought in seas, storms, deserts, but never had he seen courage burn so fiercely in people who had nothing left to give. The old Grand Master stood like a carved statue of iron will, refusing to rest, refusing to hide, refusing even to sit. He knew that if he faltered for even a moment, the island's spirit might falter with him. Around midday, the Ottomans raised their ladders. The assault on St. Michael had begun. The Janissaries charged forward in perfect formation, their steps shaking the ground, their voices rising in a battle cry that echoed across the water. Arrows darkened the sky. Smoke drifted like a ghostly curtain between the armies. Guillaume gritted his teeth and braced his shield as the first wave crashed into the wall. The sound was deafening. Metal against metal, screams mixed with the roar of flames. The attackers slammed hard against the defenders, pushing, climbing, clawing their way up the ladders. A Maltese militiaman named Tommaso, barely older than 16, swung a hammer desperately at a hand gripping the battlement. The fingers slipped. A body fell, vanishing into the chaos below. Tommaso wanted to vomit. Instead, he lifted the hammer again. Behind him, a woman named Katerina dragged her injured father into the shelter of a burnt-out storeroom. She tore her shawl into strips to stop the bleeding. She whispered prayers with trembling lips. Outside, the walls groaned under the weight of another cannon strike. War had turned everyone into something they had never intended to be. By afternoon, parts of St. Michael's outer wall were gone. Ripped away by shot after shot, the defenders stood exposed, fighting with grit that surprised even themselves. Sweat stung their eyes. Blood slicked the stones beneath their boots. They fought in a haze of smoke and heat, each breath burning like fire. And still they held. Jean de Valette watched the battle unfold, his heart burning with equal parts pride and fear. If St. Michael fell, the entire defense line would collapse. The Ottomans would sweep through Burgu and Sanglia like a flood. Civilians would be massacred. Knights would be hunted. The island would vanish beneath the weight of a merciless empire. He sent a signal. Reinforce St. Michael. No one withdraws. Boats crossed the harbor under a storm of arrows, bringing more men, more powder, more hope. Some of the boats never made it. They burst into flames or sank with their crews. But enough reached the shore to matter. Enough arrived to keep the walls standing for another hour. And then another. Evening approached and the attackers tried something new. A massive Ottoman cannon, one the size of a horse, fired a shot that hit the very center of St. Michael's main wall. The impact shook the entire peninsula. People screamed. Dust rose in a choking cloud. When it settled, a gaping wound stared back. A breach wide enough for 50 men to rush through. Guillaume stared at it, horrified. "They'll come," he whispered. "All of them." And they did. The Ottomans surged forward like a dark tide. Drums thundered. War cries split the air. The defenders, barely able to stand, rushed to fill the breach with whatever they could. Barrels, broken beams, shattered carts, even bodies of fallen enemies. Tommaso found himself standing in the very center of the breach. His hands shook. His hammer felt too heavy. But when he saw the Janissaries rushing toward him, something inside him snapped into place. He swung. He screamed. He fought. Men fell around him. Smoke burned his eyes. Someone dragged him backward before he collapsed from exhaustion. The world blurred into red and gray. Still, the line held. Just before sunset, the Ottomans withdrew, leaving behind hills of their own dead. The defenders didn't cheer. They were too tired, too broken. But they were alive. St. Michael had not fallen. That night, the people worked in near silence. They patched the walls with wet mud and rubble. They carried the wounded through the dark streets, whispering comfort they themselves did not believe. Children cried softly in the shelters. Priests moved from group to group, offering blessings for strength, for mercy, for survival. Jean de Valette walked through the ruins, lantern in hand, stopping to speak to anyone still awake. He thanked them, not as a commander, but as one human standing beside another. His presence alone lifted spirits. He was old, weary, and worn, but unbroken, just like Malta. By midnight, a storm rolled over the island, the first rain in days. It washed the blood from the stones, cooled the air. Thunder rumbled like distant drums of war. Yet for the first time in weeks, a strange peace touched the battered land. It did not last long. At dawn the next day, the cannon fire resumed. But the people of Malta no longer trembled beneath it. Their walls were shattered. Their bodies were failing. Their future hung by a thread. But something unbreakable lived inside them now. Something stronger than fear, stronger than pain, stronger than empire. A truth the Ottomans had not expected. You can break stone. You cannot break a soul ready to die free. The sun rose like a cruel overseer, blazing over Malta with unrelenting heat. Dust swirled in the streets and across the ramparts, coating every face with the taste of sand and ash. Sweat clung to the defenders' armor, and the air itself felt like a living weight, pressing down upon the shoulders of knights, soldiers, and civilians alike. Summer had become a silent enemy, more lethal than the Ottoman guns that had once thundered across the harbor. Within the cramped forts, the stench of rot and decay mingled with the smoke of fires that had not yet burned themselves out. Bodies that had fallen days before were left to the mercy of the sun, insects feasting openly on what remained. The sick whispered from shadowed corners, and even the strongest men faltered under the twin burdens of hunger and fever. In these moments, the human spirit was tested not by the clash of steel, but by the slow, creeping hand of death. The Ottoman encampments, too, suffered under the merciless summer. The vast army that had once seemed invincible now groaned under its own weight. Rations dwindled, and the water supply turned foul. Disease spread faster than the sword ever could. Dysentery, typhus, and the endless hunger gnawed at the morale of men who had expected victory, who had come to Malta with dreams of glory and conquest. Yet even amid their suffering, they were relentless, pressing against the island's walls with the stubbornness of a wave that will not retreat. From the defenders' vantage, the betrayal of the summer winds was both physical and symbolic. Every breeze carried the smell of death, of fire, of smoke and excrement mingled together in a haze over the siege lines. It seemed as if nature itself had turned against all who walked this island. The heat cracked stone and bone alike, and the forts themselves seemed to sweat with the labor of resisting so many attackers. Night brought no respite. The cicada's relentless song, a ceaseless buzz under the stars, became a reminder that the world outside the walls was alive, indifferent, and cruel. Inside Fort St. Angelo, the knights moved like shadows, faces drawn and pale. Jean Parasat de Valette, though battle-worn and racked with the weight of command, walked among them. He did not flinch at the stench of sickness. He did not look away from the hopeless eyes of a man shivering from fever on the flagstones. His words were few, but each carried the gravity of survival itself. Hold. Tonight the walls must not fall. Tomorrow we endure. And they did. Across the island, civilians suffered in silence. Women carried water in cracked jars. Children wept in hidden corners. And the elderly prayed against a God who seemed deaf to their cries. Homes had been burned or ransacked. Families were torn between hiding and fleeing. Even with the knights defending them, Malta had become a crucible, each soul tested against heat, hunger, and fear. The betrayal of summer winds was not merely a matter of discomfort. It was a trial of endurance, of character, and of will. As the days dragged on, Ottoman assaults grew sporadic. Hunger made men desperate, yet more cautious. They watched as the defenders' eyes glimmered with a stubborn, almost cruel determination. Each day the heat withered them further, but it did not break them. Reports from their scouts described the forts as ghostly citadels, men moving like phantoms among the walls. Even the Ottomans, masters of siege and strategy, began to feel that the island was a living trap, designed not by the defenders, but by the harsh, unyielding sun and the merciless summer winds. Malta's defenders knew this as well. They were starving, burning, and sick, yet they clung to life with a ferocity that bewildered friend and foe alike. Every drop of water became sacred, every morsel of bread a treasure beyond value. The sick were cared for as best they could be, the wounded bandaged with strips of cloth soaked in wine or vinegar. Fear stalked the corridors, yet bravery was born in those very shadows. Men who had once been strangers shared what little they had. Knights and peasants alike became bound by shared suffering, each act of care a silent rebellion against the cruelty surrounding them. Disease, that invisible predator, claimed its toll. Some fell without a sound, their bodies curling on stone floors while the world moved on. Others lingered, eyes hollow, lips cracked, whispering stories of loved ones lost or nightmares that came with every blink of sunlight. Yet even as the living fell, the dead became warnings, reminders, and sometimes grotesque inspiration. The Ottomans, displaying the bodies of those slain in earlier skirmishes, hoped to intimidate the islanders. Instead, it fueled rage. The betrayal of nature's cruelty and enemy display merged into a single, searing resolve. The defenders would not yield. The summer winds carried more than heat. They carried the scent of smoke from the burning countryside, the iron tang of spilled blood, and the sorrow of broken families. Yet amid this decay and despair, the islanders and knights discovered a strange resilience. Walls were patched by trembling hands, fires extinguished with scant water, and lookout posts manned despite every warning from fever and fatigue. The humans on this rock became like the island itself. Cracked, sun-baked, scarred, but unbroken. By the third week of the siege, the heat had hardened into a presence, felt in every breath and every step. The Ottomans, whose pride had been as vast as the sea they sailed upon, began to falter. Men refused to eat, soldiers turned on each other in fits of hunger-driven violence, and whispers of retreat passed like shadows through the encampments. Yet still they came, still they pressed, driven by the hope that exhaustion alone might force Malta to surrender. They did not yet understand that endurance had a power all its own. Inside the forts, Jean de Valette continued to inspire. His voice, hoarse from shouting over the din of suffering, carried a rhythm like a heartbeat. "Hold, this is our island. Our blood is the blood of its stones. We do not bow." He moved among his men, touching shoulders, checking bandages, encouraging the tired and the sick to find strength they did not know they had. Each night, he walked the walls alone, listening to the wind whistle through the broken battlements, and thought not of glory, but of survival of Malta itself. By the time the month's heat began to wane, both armies were shadows of their former selves. The Ottomans, massive and terrifying in numbers, had been hollowed by disease and hunger. The defenders, battered but unyielding, had been forged into something greater than their fears. The betrayal of the summer winds had touched both sides, yet only one had turned suffering into defiance. Malta had survived, not through victory of arms, but through the simple, extraordinary act of enduring. And in that endurance, a message was carved into memory. Empires might rise and fall, soldiers might come and go, but an island, and those who loved it enough to fight for it, could resist even the cruelty of the sun itself. The summer winds, once traitorous, had revealed not weakness, but the raw, unbreakable spirit of Malta. Dawn broke over Malta like a fragile promise. Smoke curled from shattered roofs and scorched fields, drifting across the harbor in languid streams. The forts, battered and bleeding, rose from the haze like wounded beasts, their walls scarred by cannon fire and hand-to-hand combat. Amid this ruin, one figure moved with unyielding purpose: Jean Parisot de Valette, old, battle-worn, and bearing the weight of 1,000 deaths. He was a man whose presence alone seemed to slow the chaos, as if the island itself leaned on his shoulders. The summer winds still burned, yet they could not match the fire in Valette's eyes. Every step he took along the cracked stone streets, every word he spoke to the weary defenders, was a testament to defiance. Around him, knights hobbled with injuries, civilians trembled from fever, and soldiers whispered about the Ottomans, whose numbers were greater than any hope of human endurance. Yet Valette did not flinch, did not doubt. His gaze pierced the smoke, seeing beyond the present suffering to a future where Malta might still stand. Inside Fort St. Angelo, he moved through the wounded with a quiet authority. "Take heart," he said to a young knight whose leg had been shattered by cannon fire. "Your courage is the island's shield." The man, eyes wide with pain, nodded, clutching his crutch as if it were a sword. Valette's presence turned fear into purpose, exhaustion into resolve. Even in a fortress that seemed on the brink of collapse, Hope took root in his calm, unwavering demeanor. Outside the walls, the Ottomans had not ceased their assaults, though the heat and disease had slowed them. Scouts reported strange activity among the defenders. Men carrying water and bandages, soldiers reinforcing weak points, women and children hauling supplies up fractured stairways. It was as though the spirit of Malta itself had taken flesh and walked among the living. And at its heart, guiding, protecting, and inspiring, was Valette. Each night, he climbed the ramparts alone, listening to the cries of the wounded, the groans of the dying, and the distant murmurs of the enemy. He did not pray for victory, for even he knew the odds were monstrous. Instead, he prayed for endurance, for courage, for the ability of his men to hold the walls long enough for salvation to arrive. Every heartbeat of the island seemed tied to his own, and when he spoke to the defenders, his voice carried not only orders but belief, the belief that the impossible could yet be achieved. Word of Valette's steadfastness spread quickly. Knights who had despaired of holding the forts found renewed strength in his presence. Civilians, who had thought themselves abandoned, discovered courage they did not know existed. Even the sick, feverish, and weak found reason to rise for the sake of the island. It was not magic, nor a clever trick of morale. It was human determination, magnified by a leader who had refused to bow. In the darkness, he was a lantern, burning brighter than the flames that had consumed so many homes. The Ottomans, observing from their camps, began to recognize the source of this strange, unbreakable resistance. They saw the walls reinforced each night, the wounded still fighting, the terrified still defending. And they saw the figure at the center of it all, pacing the ramparts, raising his sword not just in command but in the silent promise that Malta would not fall so easily. For every fortress that burned, every cannonball that shattered stone, Valette's presence reminded the defenders that surrender was not yet an option. On one blistering afternoon, as cannon smoke mingled with the haze of dust, Valette addressed the assembled knights. His voice rose over the din, sharp and commanding. Our island is small, our numbers few, but our courage is greater than their empire. Every wall you hold, every breath you draw, is a victory. The enemy believes in their might. We believe in each other, and that is a power they cannot touch. Silence followed, thick with the weight of truth. And then, as if released from a spell, the defenders raised their swords, hammers, and voices, echoing his defiance across the shattered harbor. Valette did not lead from behind. He fought in the streets, alongside his men, each encounter a testament to endurance and the human will. Enemy swords clanged against his own, bullets grazed his armor, and the dust of the battlefield coated his hair and face. Yet he never faltered. Every act of courage became contagious. Men who had thought themselves too weak or too weary to continue found themselves driven onward, inspired by a leader who refused to die quietly in the shadows of history. Amid this chaos, Valette's presence also brought strategy. Nights were spent mapping weak points, reinforcing walls with the little stone and timber remaining, rationing what water and food could be spared, and preparing for assaults that seemed to come in waves. Each plan carried the weight of survival, not glory. Every order was delivered with the understanding that failure meant death for hundreds, perhaps thousands. Yet in his calm, the defenders sensed that there was a path forward, even in the darkest hours. The psychological warfare of the siege had already begun to turn the Ottomans inward. Disease and hunger gnawed at their morale, and Valette's unyielding presence only magnified the despair. Reports filtered through enemy lines of the old Grand Master walking the walls like a phantom, of defenders moving with uncanny determination. For every body the Ottomans cut down, they realized that Malta's heart would not be so easily broken. In these moments, the island's fate no longer seemed tied solely to stone and steel. It was bound to the courage and resilience of one man. As the summer dragged on, and the betrayal of winds, fire, and disease continued to test all who walked Malta's streets, Valette remained the constant. He reminded men that courage was not absence of fear but the triumph over it. He reminded them that survival was not merely holding the walls but protecting the people, the homes, the spirit of the island itself. Every word, every action, every glance across the battlefield became a symbol of defiance that no cannon or sword could shatter. By the end of the month, it was clear to both friend and foe that Malta would endure, not because it was fortified by stone alone, but because it was fortified by the human heart, by the courage, resilience, and unyielding spirit of Jean de Valette. He had become more than a commander. He had become the heartbeat of the island, a living emblem of hope amid ruin. The smoke of battle, the cries of the wounded, and the moans of the dying did not silence him. Instead, they became the chorus to which he led, a symphony of endurance and defiance that would echo far beyond the walls of Malta. In the shadow of exhaustion and despair, the defenders realized something profound. Even when surrounded by fire and death, even when the odds seemed insurmountable, a single unbroken soul could lift the hearts of many. And in Jean de Valette, they found that soul. Malta had a hero, and that hero would ensure that its story was not one of surrender, but of survival, courage, and defiance against an empire that had believed nothing could stop it. And so, amid smoke, fever, and the ever-present threat of annihilation, Jean de Valette rose, not merely as a man, but as the spirit of Malta itself, a flame that refused to be extinguished. In the darkest days of the siege, when hope seemed a distant memory, he reminded the island, and the world, that courage could endure, even when everything else had fallen. Night fell over Malta like a dark curtain, thick and suffocating. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and salt, mingling into a haze that hung heavy over the forts and streets. The island trembled with anticipation, every stone, every plank, every heartbeat aware that the final storm was coming. The Ottomans had regrouped, weary but relentless, readying themselves for the assault that could end the siege once and for all. The defenders, fewer than 6,000 souls, braced for the onslaught that would test not only their courage but their very will to survive. Fort St. Angelo, battered and cracked, became the center of this desperate defense. Jean de Valette moved along the ramparts, his eyes scanning the darkened horizon where hundreds of enemy torches flickered like a swarm of fireflies, each one carrying the promise of death. He spoke in quiet commands, sharp and precise, each word cutting through the night. Hold the gates. Every man must stand his post. Malta cannot fall. Around him, knights and soldiers tightened grips on pikes, swords, and matchlocks, preparing for what might be the final hours of their lives. As the first moonlight touched the walls, the Ottomans surged forward. Drums pounded, the sound echoing across the harbor and into the hearts of those defending the island. War cries cut through the night, sharp and unyielding, a wave of sound meant to drown out courage and hope. And yet, on the walls, the defenders stood firm. Each man understood the stakes. Behind them lay families, homes, and an island that had refused to bow for generations. Ahead lay a storm of steel, fire, and death. The first clash was brutal and immediate. Ottoman soldiers, armored and numerous, struck against the gates with battering rams, their momentum shaking the ancient stones. Arrows darkened the sky, finding gaps in armor and the unprotected flesh beneath. Cannons roared, sending splintered wood and flying stone across the narrow streets. Screams rose and fell in waves, mingling with the clash of swords and the thud of bodies hitting stone. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the iron tang of blood. Malta had become a furnace, and every man and woman within it was tested to the limits of human endurance. In the chaos, Jean de Valette did not falter. He moved through the smoke, sword in hand, encouraging, correcting, and inspiring. A young knight, pinned under a fallen timber, looked up at him with desperation. Valette knelt, lifting the weight with the strength of a dozen men, and whispered, "Live! Malta needs you." The young man scrambled to his feet, rejoining the fight. Such moments, small but profound, became the thread holding together the fraying fabric of defense. The gates shook again under relentless assault. Splinters flew, and with each strike, the defenders felt the world narrowing to a single point of choice. Fight, die, or surrender. Behind the walls, Civilians huddled in darkened corners, clutching one another, praying to gods both old and new. Every heart on the island pulsed with terror, hope, and defiance, intertwined so tightly that even the air seemed charged with the weight of survival. Hours passed like days. The Ottomans, though vast in number, began to feel the exhaustion that had long haunted the defenders. Hunger, heat, and the relentless pressure of walls that refused to crumble had begun to gnaw at their morale. Yet they pressed on, each wave more desperate than the last. Siege engines splintered under fire, ladders fell, and yet men climbed, shouting their defiance and striking at defenders with swords and axes. Every moment was a crucible, every breath a battle between life and death. Amid the maelstrom, acts of heroism shone like sparks in the dark. A soldier, his arm severed by a blade, dragged himself across the ramparts to close a gap in the wall. A woman, her husband fallen, hurled buckets of boiling water from the battlements, turning the tide of one small skirmish. Each act was a testament not only to courage but to the shared humanity that bound this island together in the face of annihilation. Valette witnessed these deeds, his chest swelling with pride and sorrow alike. Each life saved was a victory, each loss, a wound that would linger in memory forever. As dawn began to color the horizon with faint hues of orange and violet, the final surge began. The Ottomans poured every remaining soldier into the assault. Drums thundered, war cries escalated, and the gates shook as though the earth itself had joined the attack. Smoke and dust made vision nearly impossible. Screams of the dying echoed through narrow streets. The defenders, though exhausted beyond measure, met each wave with unwavering courage. Every strike, every parry, every desperate shove of a pike became a stand against oblivion itself. Time seemed to stretch, each hour a lifetime. Valette's voice carried above the chaos, rallying the men. For Malta, for honor, for every soul on this island. His words ignited a spark in the weary hearts, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming force, human will could bend but not break. The gates creaked, splintered, and groaned, yet held. Every inch gained by the Ottomans was contested, every victory bought at the cost of countless lives. The island itself seemed to hold its breath, suspended between survival and annihilation. By mid-morning, the fighting reached a fever pitch. The Ottomans, sensing the fragility of the gates, launched ladders against the walls, charging with a ferocity born of desperation. Men fell on both sides, bodies tumbling into the narrow streets below. Cannon fire shattered timber and stone alike. The defenders, driven by the courage of their leader, met the attackers with a resolve that astonished even the enemy. One by one, ladders were broken, climbers thrown into the dust, and the assault stalled by the sheer stubbornness of those who refused to die quietly. Amid the devastation, a quiet moment passed. Valette, standing atop the ramparts, looked across the battlefield, surveying the smoke, the fire, and the human cost of this final gate. For a moment, the noise faded. He saw not just the enemy, but the courage of his men, the resilience of the civilians, and the spirit of Malta itself. This was a stand not for glory, nor for conquest, but for survival. And in that realization, every strike of the sword, every block of the pike, every shout of defiance became part of something greater, the heartbeat of an island refusing to be silenced. By afternoon, the assault began to falter. Exhaustion had hollowed out the Ottoman ranks. Disease, hunger, and the unyielding spirit of the defenders combined to create a wall that even an empire could not break. The gates, though battered, remained closed. Malta had survived, once again, not by the strength of stone alone, but by the courage, sacrifice, and endurance of its people and their unbroken leader. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the devastated island, Valette surveyed the final gate. Smoke and blood mixed with the fading light, turning the streets into rivers of red and ash. The defenders, battered, bleeding, but unbowed, held their positions. Each face bore the marks of fear, grief, and determination. Every step forward, every moment of resistance, had been a defiance against the oblivion that had threatened to consume them. And for a fleeting moment, the island breathed, alive in its suffering yet unbroken in spirit. The last gate had not fallen, and in that failure of the enemy, the soul of Malta endured. The island had proven, against impossible odds, that courage, resilience, and the indomitable will of its people could defy even the mightiest empire. The cost had been unimaginable, yet the victory, however temporary and fragile, shone like a beacon against the gathering darkness. The morning sky over Malta was heavy with smoke and tension. The air still carried the scent of blood, fire, and the relentless sun that had baked the island into a crucible of suffering. For weeks, the defenders had endured bombardments, disease, and hunger, and now, from beyond the horizon, a flicker of hope appeared. The sails of a Spanish relief fleet, gleaming like silver against the dark blue Mediterranean, cutting through the smoke of battle and bringing with them the promise of reinforcements. Jean de Valette, standing atop the walls of Fort St. Angelo, felt a surge of relief tempered by caution. The Ottomans had not yet yielded, and even with the Spanish fleet approaching, the island's people could not afford to falter. "Hold your lines," he shouted to the weary defenders, his voice carrying across the battered streets. "The tide is turning, but the fight is not over." Around him, men gripped their weapons tighter, hearts beating in rhythm with the anticipation and fear that had defined the siege for months. As the Spanish forces landed, the Ottomans recognized that the war was shifting. Exhausted soldiers who had already fought beyond their limits now faced fresh troops, disciplined and determined, marching under banners of red and gold. The clash was inevitable. Dust rose from the dry earth as cavalry and infantry collided, swords ringing against steel, the cries of men echoing across the island. The Mediterranean, once a backdrop of serene blue, became a canvas for the chaos and carnage of two worlds meeting in a final, brutal reckoning. From the cliffs overlooking the harbor, civilians watched as reinforcements bolstered the defenders' ranks. Families who had huddled in fear now dared to hope. Women carried water to the wounded, children ran messages along the walls, and even the elderly lent their hands to patch fortifications. Malta's streets, still scarred with blood and ruin, became a stage for a battle that would decide the fate of the island, and perhaps the course of history itself. Jean de Valette moved through the fighting like a shadow of resolve. His sword found targets with precision, cutting down foes while guiding his own men to hold critical positions. Every moment of the clash tested leadership, courage, and endurance. Knights, already battered by weeks of siege, found renewed strength in the presence of both their Grand Master and the fresh Spanish troops. Together, they formed a living wall, an unyielding barrier against the tide of the Ottoman army. The Ottomans, recognizing the sudden threat of the relief force, redoubled their efforts. Their numbers, vast as they were, now contended with exhaustion, dwindling supplies, and a renewed enemy presence. They hurled themselves at the walls with desperate ferocity, their war cries rising like a storm, yet the defenders held firm. Every cannon fired, every sword swung, every pike thrust became an act of defiance against an empire that had believed the island would fall. And now, the arrival of Spain made that defiance an unstoppable force. The battlefield became a whirlwind of movement, smoke, and fire. Cavalry clashed in narrow streets, their hooves striking sparks from stone. Infantry met with a brutal elegance, men falling in waves, bodies colliding in the dust. Arrows and musket fire filled the air with deadly arcs, while cannons shook the ground and sent splintered wood flying through the chaos. Every moment was a test of endurance and courage, every heartbeat a fragile bridge between life and death. Amid the carnage, acts of heroism illuminated the horror. A young Spanish soldier, separated from his unit, carried a wounded comrade across an open courtyard under a hail of arrows. A Maltese civilian, armed with nothing but a broken pike, blocked a group of Ottomans from reaching a gate, buying precious minutes for reinforcements to arrive. Each gesture, small in isolation, became monumental in the tide of battle. Courage, it seemed, was contagious, spreading faster than fear could take hold. Jean de Valette, at the heart of the fighting, exemplified this resilience. He moved from group to group, rallying defenders, redistributing supplies, and directing reinforcements to critical points. His eyes, sharp despite weeks of exhaustion, scanned the battlefield, anticipating enemy movements and turning the tide with both strategy and sheer willpower. In his presence, men who had faced death countless times found themselves fighting with renewed vigor, their loyalty and courage amplified by the certainty that Malta's Grand Master would not yield. Hours dragged on, and the Mediterranean sun climbed higher, relentless as ever. The Ottomans began to falter, their formations breaking under combined pressure from the island's defenders and the Spanish relief troops. Exhaustion, hunger, and disease had already weakened their ranks, and now they faced a force that refused to be intimidated. Shouts of victory began to mingle with cries of pain, and the clash of steel became punctuated by the moans of the dying. Yet even as the battle swirled around them, the defenders understood that this was more than a fight for Malta. It was a fight for survival, honor, and the legacy of a people who refused to surrender. The turning point came with a surge at Fort St. Michael, where the Ottomans concentrated their assault in an attempt to break the defenders' line. Knights and soldiers, led by Valette and the Spanish commander, met them with a coordinated counterattack. Pike met blade, musket fire met charging cavalry, and the streets became a blur of movement and chaos. Slowly, inexorably, the Ottomans were pushed back, their formations unraveling as the defenders seized the advantage. Every victory came at a terrible cost, yet each was a testament to human determination against overwhelming odds. By late afternoon, the Ottomans' morale crumbled completely. Their numbers, once a terrifying tide, dwindled under constant pressure and relentless resistance. Retreat became the only viable option, and men who had believed in the inevitability of conquest now fled across the scarred landscape, leaving behind weapons, supplies, and the bodies of comrades who had fallen in vain. The defenders, exhausted but unbroken, pursued cautiously, ensuring that the enemy's retreat became a disorganized rout rather than a renewed assault. As dusk settled, the battlefield lay in ruin. Smoke rose from smoldering buildings, bodies littered the streets, and the scent of blood and fire lingered like a ghost over the island. Yet amidst the devastation, Malta stood. The walls remained intact, the forts had not fallen, and the survivors, though battered and weary, had triumphed. Jean de Valette, standing atop the ramparts once more, watched the horizon where the last Ottoman ships vanished into the distance. His face bore the exhaustion of leadership, the grief for lives lost, and the quiet satisfaction of survival. The Spanish relief forces, though not a cure for the months of suffering, brought a renewed sense of hope. Their arrival had not only repelled the Ottomans but ensured that Malta's story would not end in destruction. The island had endured, and in doing so, it had changed the course of history. Every man, woman, and child who had survived the siege carried the memory of those who had fallen, and the knowledge that their courage had altered the fate of Europe itself. In the quiet that followed, Malta's defenders reflected on the cost of survival. Streets that had once rung with screams now echoed with the weary silence of the living. The island had been transformed into a graveyard, a battlefield, and a fortress all at once. Yet even in ruin, Malta's spirit remained unbroken, embodied in the courage of its people and the leadership of a grand master who had refused to yield when all hope seemed lost. And so, when the cross finally met the crescent, it was not merely a clash of armies, but a collision of determination, will, and human resilience. One side sought conquest, the other survival. And in the end, it was the indomitable courage of Malta's defenders, guided by Jean de Valette and bolstered by allies who had answered the call of hope, that turned the tide. The battle was over, but the memory of its sacrifice would echo across the centuries, a testament to the power of human will against the seemingly impossible. Silence fell over Malta like a fragile, trembling veil. Smoke still lingered above the forts, curling upward from smoldering ruins, while the scent of blood, gunpowder, and fire clung to the cracked streets. The air was thick with the echoes of battle, the cries of the dying, the roar of cannon, the clash of steel. all now fading into memory. Across the island, survivors emerged from shadowed corners, blinking in the harsh Mediterranean sun, each step a testament to endurance and defiance. The Ottoman fleet, once a terrifying force that darkened the horizon, had vanished into the distance. Their retreat was not quiet nor orderly. Ships limped away, many damaged by cannon fire and storms, others carrying wounded and exhausted soldiers who had believed themselves unstoppable. What remained on Malta was a landscape of ruin. Shattered gates, scorched homes, and the twisted remnants of war machines. Yet amid this devastation, one truth endured. The island had held. Against 40,000 attackers, less than 6,000 defenders had resisted, endured, and survived. Jean de Valette, old but unbroken, walked the walls of Fort St. Angelo. His armor bore scratches from countless encounters. His hands were calloused, and his face carried the weight of grief and responsibility. Yet his eyes, bright and unyielding, surveyed the island with a mixture of sorrow and pride. Every stone of the fortress, every burned roof, every scarred street bore witness to the courage of those who had fought and died. Malta had survived not because of walls alone, but because of human spirit, unyielding, defiant, and brave. Civilians, too, emerged to witness the aftermath. Women gathered children in trembling arms, fathers embraced sons and daughters, and the elderly wept quietly among the ruins of their homes. The streets were littered with the dead and the wounded, a stark reminder of the human cost of resistance. Each survivor carried the memory of lost neighbors, friends, and family, their sorrow tempered by the extraordinary triumph that had saved their island from oblivion. In their eyes burned a mixture of grief and gratitude, grief for what had been lost, and gratitude for what had endured. Fort St. Michael and Fort St. Angelo, once battered beyond hope, now stood as monuments to perseverance. The walls, scarred and cracked, told stories of nights spent reinforcing stones with trembling hands, of cannonballs deflected by sheer determination, of soldiers and civilians working together in desperate defiance of a seemingly invincible foe. The forts had become more than stone and mortar. They had become symbols of courage, endurance, and the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to surrender. The battlefield beyond the forts was a grim testament to the ferocity of the siege. Ottoman banners, once proud and menacing, lay trampled in the dust. Broken weapons, tattered armor, and the lifeless bodies of fallen soldiers littered the streets. For every attacker who had sought to conquer Malta, a defender had matched them in courage and sacrifice. And in the silence that followed, the island seemed to breathe once more, slowly and carefully, aware that it had been spared a fate that had claimed so many others before. Yet the victory was not without reflection. Jean de Valette walked among the wounded, offering words of comfort to the dying and tending, when possible, to the gravely injured. His presence was a reminder that leadership is measured not only in strategy but in compassion, that the cost of survival is counted not only in walls held but in lives protected. Each gesture, each quiet word, became a testament to the humanity that had endured amidst the fire and blood. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, orange shadows over the island, the surviving defenders gathered on the walls. They were battered, exhausted, and grief-stricken, yet they stood together. Knights, soldiers, and civilians alike formed a silent line, their faces illuminated by the dying light, a final tableau of courage and endurance. Malta had survived, barely, yet it had survived in full defiance of expectation. The empire that had believed itself unstoppable had been forced to retreat, leaving behind only silence, ash, and the indelible mark of human courage. The impact of this survival extended far beyond the island's shores. News of Malta's endurance spread like wildfire across Europe, inspiring hope in kingdoms that had feared the advance of the Ottoman Empire. The tiny island, defended by so few against so many, had changed the course of history. Its resistance demonstrated that even the mightiest empires could be checked by courage, strategy, and unyielding resolve. Malta became a symbol, a testament to the idea that the human spirit, when united in defense of home and honor, could defy the impossible. Within the walls, Jean de Valette reflected on the cost of victory. He counted the losses silently, the knights who had fallen defending their posts, the civilians who had perished in the chaos, the families torn apart by fire and cannon. Yet amidst this grief, there was pride. Pride not in conquest, but in survival. Not in glory, but in the courage of those who had stood firm when all seemed lost. He understood that history would remember the siege not for the walls, nor the weapons, but for the resilience, sacrifice, and unbroken will of the defenders. As night fell over the island, a strange calm descended. Fires burned low in the streets, and the cries of the wounded gave way to the quiet hum of survival. The Mediterranean, once a stage for war and destruction, reflected the last rays of sun like a mirror to the island's endurance. Malta had been scarred, battered, and broken in many ways, but it had not fallen. It had withstood the onslaught of an empire, endured the cruelty of war, and emerged as a beacon of resilience in a world often defined by conquest and betrayal. The story of Malta's survival would be told for centuries. Scholars, chroniclers, and storytellers would recount the courage of its defenders, the wisdom and resolve of Jean de Valette, and the indomitable spirit of a people who refused to surrender. Every cannonball embedded in stone, every scar on a wall, every worn weapon would serve as a testament to the human cost and the enduring power of unity in the face of overwhelming odds. Malta had become more than an island. It had become a symbol of hope, courage, and the extraordinary potential of the human spirit. And as the final stars emerged in the darkened sky, Malta rested, battered but alive, silent yet alive, a tiny rock in the Mediterranean that had stopped an empire. The siege had ended, but the story endured. The island, and its people, had proven that courage and resilience could alter the course of history, that even in the face of devastation, survival and defiance could triumph. Malta had changed the tide of history, leaving behind a legacy that would echo across centuries.